At this point, you grab your soldering iron, you wipe it on your damp sponge, and we're going to tin it. So we melt some solder onto the tip of the soldering iron and then wipe it off again. The tip of the soldering iron should now be a shiny silver colour. Put the tip of the soldering iron onto the pad and the leg that's sticking out of the board. Hold it for 3 seconds. Feed the solder in until you can see it melt. Move the solder out of the way and then remove the soldering iron. Repeat the same process for each solder joint. Soldering iron touching both the leg of the component and the pad. Feed the solder in, remove the solder, then remove the soldering iron. Repeat for all of the solder joints. If the solder joint doesn't look properly soldered, such as the one just here, where you can still see some of the hole, you'll need to reapply the solder. Hold the soldering iron in place, place a tiny amount of solder on it and then remove the soldering iron. And then we can see all of the solder joints are complete. At this point, the excess legs can be removed. Use a pair of wire cutters to do this. Cut near the solder joint and make sure you snip gently. If the leg doesn't fall off immediately, then give it a quick wiggle and it soon will. Try to point it away from you when cutting so the bits do not go into your eye. The next component is the chip holder. Look carefully as one end has a small notch in and the other end doesn't. On your PCB, the small notch is determined by the black outline on the board. When you place it in, make sure the two notches line up. It might be fiddly, it might need a bit of a wiggle to get it in place. Check that it is flat to the board. And then on the reverse, being careful that this chip holder doesn't fall out, check that all of the legs are present. There's no need to count them, just make sure every hole across the middle here has got a leg through it. It might be easier to put the PCB flat down to enable soldering. It is vital on the chip holder that two legs do not touch. Don't forget to tin your soldering iron before you start, wiping it on the sponge, melting a small amount of solder on the end, and then wiping it on the sponge again. Do one leg at a time, making sure that the soldering iron tip is touching both the leg and the pad. Soldering iron in, count to 3, and then put the solder in. Remove the solder out of the way, remove the soldering iron out of the way. Once you've done a few, the chip holder won't fall out, so that will make it much easier. Make sure your piece of solder doesn't get too short. Once you're done, you can have a look at your soldering and check that every single leg is soldered correctly. If any don't look perfect, for example this one here, then it's a simple case of adding a little bit more solder. Reapply the soldering iron and add a little bit more solder. If two of your legs touch, you'll need to separate them. Clean your soldering iron and heat up right between the two lumps of solder and slowly drag between it. That will then separate the two solder joints. The next component is the download socket used to connect the PCB to the computer. This will need to be placed with the outer ring facing towards the outside of your PCB board. You should be able to push it in and it will click, like so. Check that it is as flat to the board as you can possibly get it by pushing it in. On the underside of the PCB, check that you have got 5 legs sticking through. One on its own, 1, 2, 1, 2. When you're ready to solder, bear in mind that the 2 legs that touch will touch once soldered. Again, cleaning the soldering iron. We'll do this one on its own first. These 2 are going to touch, they're allowed to, they're the only ones on the board, there and here, that are allowed to touch. When done, check there are no gaps. If you can still see any holes, such as here, then you'll need to add more solder. The next component is a switch. When you look at the switch, it has got a flat edge, which you can see towards the top here. That flat edge needs to line up on the PCB with the flat edge in the diagram. There are 2 switches to be added. They will feel quite loose, but that is perfectly normal. Of course, you still need to be able to press them. Turn the PCB over to solder, being careful the switches do not fall out. It might be useful to be using the clamp again at this point. All 4 legs of each switch need soldering in. It's vital the LEDs go around the correct way. On each LED, there is a short and a long leg. There is a clue on the PCB that says the short LED lead should be on the outside. So make sure that when you place it in, the short leg is facing outwards. The LEDs do not need to go all the way into the board. We will straighten them up later. Make sure you know which colours are going where. They should reflect the pattern that you chose. Check now that all of the outside legs are the short ones. If not, this is the time to change them around. If you checked it and they're correct, you'll need to get a grid, one of these, to place the LEDs in. But be careful turning the circuit over, as the LEDs will probably fall out. Line it up, then turn it over, and what you're hoping to get is, with the PCB level, all of the LEDs should be flat to the yellow surface. You can push them through to get them in the correct place. Once Once all the LEDs are level and the circuit board is level, you can begin soldering. Use a clamp to prop it up, otherwise your LEDs will fall straight out again. Make sure the two legs of the LEDs do not touch. If your solder gets too short, get another piece. Once you've finished, you can remove the PCB and check all of your soldering joints. If you can see any holes or any legs touching, you'll need to sort this out. The excess legs can be removed with the wire cutters as before. Don't forget to point this down to make sure nothing goes in your eyes. The only thing left to solder now is the battery box. The battery box has two wires, one black one, one red one. Both wires are fed from behind through the big hole in the corner. And then the red one will loop over into the hole where it says red. It would be useful to bend this wire over by 90 degrees so it doesn't fall out again. The black one goes into the hole where it says black. Again, bend it over. On the reverse of the PCB, you'll need to then solder these two wires. Be careful not to melt the plastic on the black or red wire. You can then pull the excess wire back through the board and use the hole for its purpose. It is a strain relief hole, so the battery pack will not become disconnected. All of your soldering is now complete. The next stage is inserting the chip. Make sure you have the correct chip. Check with your teacher if you're unsure. It is written on top. Locate the notch on the end of the chip. It will only be on one end, and that notch will line up with the notch on the PCB. Gently push it into place. Make sure no legs are left outside. You will then need to insert the batteries. Make sure it is turned off. Slide the cover away and place the batteries in, following the diagram, in the bottom of the battery box.